Hello and welcome to this video series on personality. This particular video is going to be centered on the personality trait agreeableness, which is all about compassion and empathy. But what it really comes down to is how highly you value yourself versus other people's needs. And someone with high agreeableness tends to value other people's needs as highly or above their own, whereas someone with low agreeableness tends to value their own needs first. If you're new to this channel and you're interested in the topic of personality, then definitely feel free to check out some of my other videos, which start off more broadly about personality and then delve into some of the specific personality traits from the Big Five. So first of all, we're going to be looking at the main traits and signs of someone with high and low agreeableness, and then we're going to break agreeableness down into its two subcomponents or two sub-traits and look at what are the main signs of those. So people with high agreeableness are often thought of as kind, warm, polite, accommodating, caring, and empathetic, whereas people with low agreeableness tend to be thought of as selfish, ruthless, vengeful, unsympathetic, and competitive. And later on in the video, we'll go into this more deeply and actually work out if all of these things are objectively bad. So just like I've done with the other traits that I've covered so far, I've broken down those traits into their two sub-traits. And here, the two sub-traits are compassion and politeness. And now we're going to go through each of those sub-traits and look at the main telling signs of them. So starting off with the trait of compassion, in a single line, what it comes down to is being interested in the needs of others. And some of the telling signs are feeling others' emotions, inquire about others' well-being, sympathize with others' feelings, take time for others, take an interest in other people's lives, have a soft side, like to do things for others, and interested in other people's problems. And now with politeness, in a single line, it comes down to a respect for authority and social conventions. And people with high politeness tends to respect authority, don't believe that they are better than others, hate to seem pushy, don't take advantage of others, avoid imposing their will on others, rarely put people under pressure, avoid insulting people, avoid conflict, and not out for personal gain. Now when it comes to agreeableness, out of all of the traits from the Big Five, this is the one where the language involved is probably most skewed towards positivity. So what I mean by that is people with high agreeableness, based on the language of the traits involved, it seems like people with high agreeableness are objectively better people, or the traits are better to have. Whereas in reality, as we'll see later on, there are some pros and cons, and as I've mentioned previously in other videos, for every trait, there's no such thing as being good or bad. They're simply about trade-offs. And in some instances or environments, having high agreeableness is a good thing, whereas in others, it can be a bad thing. And we're going to be looking at some of the reasons why. So starting with high agreeableness, is there such thing as being too agreeable? Despite all of the warmth and the compassion that comes along with this personality trait, there's also some major setbacks. And one of them is being too agreeable or too compassionate. This basically just means that you end up putting other people's needs above your own, and over time this can lead to a build-up of resentment. Now you might be thinking, isn't it down to the free will of that individual who has high agreeableness that they're putting other people's needs above their own? Well, it turns out to some extent this is true, but actually often there are times where they'd rather be a little bit more selfish or stand up for themselves, but they kind of have this overriding sensation that they're trying to avoid conflict, they don't want to put other people down, they don't want to inconvenience people, and this comes from a good place, but sometimes to the detriment of that individual. Now, one of the more tangible examples of this is that people with high agreeableness on average tends to earn less money. You can probably think of a few reasons why this may be the case. One of them could be that they lack a little bit of assertiveness, they don't want to put themselves forward, they don't want to come across as stern or needy or inconvenient for other people, and therefore they're more likely to stay metaphorically in the shadow rather than going up and asking for a raise. Another reason though is that it creates a bit of a self-reinforcing effect. And as we've seen, people who tend to do slightly better, rise the ranks and earn more money tend to be a little bit more disagreeable. And therefore the kinds of people who end up running the companies, either managers or CEOs, tend to be a little bit lower, relatively speaking, on agreeableness. And therefore they're less likely to try to cater for those people with high agreeableness and give them raises and promotions prematurely or proactively. There's also the whole concept of nice guys finish last. And even though it's a bit of a stereotype, there is a slither of truth to it. And that's because in the business world, like I've said, people who are too nice tend to not ask for promotions or raises, and therefore they're not actually given them. But this also applies in things such as the dating world, where people like to have that balance between assertiveness, competitiveness, but also kind of compassion and empathy. And if you're too far on either one, then it tends to be a little bit detrimental. And the last disadvantage to having too high agreeableness is that, like I alluded to earlier, it kind of leads to a build-up of resentment. Because you're putting other people's needs above your own so frequently, it tends to lead to a kind of a bitter feeling that doesn't really surface initially because you don't want to inconvenience people or offend anyone, but over time this can actually manifest into something more substantial. Now, of course, people with high agreeableness tend not to ever get to the point where they square off with people or get into a physical confrontation because it's not in their nature. But what can happen is if the buildup of resentment reaches a certain point, then it can lead to passive aggressive behavior. Now let's turn our attention to low agreeableness, and we're going to be looking at some of the pros and cons of this, starting with the obvious in that they often come across as callous and ruthless. And depending on your level of disagreeableness or how low you are on agreeableness, this may be somewhat true. But another more common symptom, for the lack of a better phrase, of low agreeableness is stubbornness. Because if you're able to kind of stand up for your own needs and refuse to compromise, this is a sign of low agreeableness, but it often manifests in stubbornness. Now, of course, there are times where this is a good thing, because sticking with your principles, especially when those principles are solid, despite some kind of outside influence, can actually be a net positive. But at the same time, if those principles don't carry much weight, or if you're not able to change your mind and be receptive to outside feedback, then of course this can be negative as well. Now, it is worth noting that many of the terms and descriptive adjectives when it comes to low agreeableness tends to be very negative, and it makes it sound like these are a bad thing. And obviously in some cases they are, but there are also some reasons why it could be a good thing, and one of them is having a higher salary. Like I mentioned earlier, people with high agreeableness tends to earn less money, and that's for the reasons mentioned previously. But for people with low agreeableness, the ability to stand up for yourself, request a raise or a promotion when you feel like you've earned it, can actually lead to progression in the working world. Another side effect of low agreeableness is that you don't have that build-up of resentment from doing things or catering to other people's needs above your own, because often they don't actually do this in the first place. They either put their own needs first, or they are a lot less likely to go overboard in putting other people's needs first. Another aspect of success involves competition. And we often see in the real world, whether it's in industry or in sports, that competition or competitiveness often drives success. And this is kind of natural and obvious, because if you're competitive, you're more likely to try to put yourself above others. And when competitiveness is channeled in a socially acceptable way, then we often look up to these people and praise them for their assertiveness and their kind of bluntness and their approach to life and their field. When we look at some of the most successful athletes in recent history, such as Michael Jordan in basketball, or some of the boxers like Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson, obviously these people are very competitive, and without that competitive instinct, these people likely wouldn't have reached the levels that they did. So we often praise these people for their competitive instincts, and they've reached a level of success that they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, of course, if this competitiveness or low agreeableness is channeled in antisocial means, then the consequences can be quite drastic. And one of the main ones is that low agreeableness tends to be one of the biggest predictors of criminality and incarceration. Another interesting finding is that men on average tend to be lower in agreeableness than women. And when it comes to the average case, such as the average guy and the average girl, you will find there's not a great deal of difference, but where this really comes into play is in the extremes. So for example, the most disagreeable people tend to be mainly men, and the most agreeable people tend to be mainly women. And that's why there's a disproportionate amount of people in jail and criminals that are men versus women. The other thing relating to this involves psychopaths. And psychopaths in general are some of the people who have the lowest levels of agreeableness. That lack of compassion and empathy makes it easier for them to do what they want to do and not really feel that care or consideration for others. Now, I will be making a video soon about psychopaths, what exactly they are, how to understand them, how they relate in terms of personality, and then some of the signs to be able to recognize them. So if you're interested in this whole idea, then definitely subscribe and keep an eye out for that one. But very quickly, if psychopathy and criminality are some of the most prominent manifestations of being super low on agreeableness, then what is the equivalent in high agreeableness? And one of them is something called dependent personality disorder. And these are people who are so hardwired for care that they actually put other people's needs so disproportionately above their own that they end up feeling all of those things that I mentioned previously, from resentment. But more obvious than that, they lack the ability to take care of their own needs and interests, and this leads to that whole aspect of dependency. It should be unsurprising to hear that this disorder mainly affects women, and that's for the same reasons why criminality and incarceration affects men, that women on average tend to be higher in agreeableness, and this manifests to the most extreme cases in the extremes. So people with the highest level of agreeableness tends to be mainly women, and therefore people who suffer from things such as dependent personality disorder tend to be largely women too. Now, one of the things that I haven't really mentioned is that although competitiveness and competition tends to correlate with low agreeableness, there's something else about low agreeableness that is also true, and that is it's also related to the whole concept of predatory aggression. Now, this should make sense when it comes to the obvious example of psychopaths, but actually being a predator or having that predatory aggression has actually served our ancestors rather well in the past. And when it comes to things such as hunting, if you're overly compassionate, then you might not actually go ahead with the hunt, and therefore you're more likely to die or starve as a result. So this whole instinct for competitiveness and predatory aggression, and this can come in the form of hunting, is actually very useful or has been useful for our survival. In fact, there are still echoes of this in modern times, and if you look at a huge proportion of sports, it involves some kind of projectile and some kind of target, and this is true in the case of football, golf, and many more. You can also analyze this further and look at, in the world of football, when they score a goal, the kind of celebrations that they exhibit. In the past, when the hunter finally caught their prey, they thrust their arm forward with their pointed object or spear, and this is mirrored in the sporting world where you see many celebrations, and then at the end you lift up the prize, signifying to others that you have conquered this particular challenge. And this is something again you see in goal celebrations, in winning trophy celebrations, and many more examples. So there's one more concept I want to cover, and that is called theory of mind. And this is a psychological concept which really comes down to your ability to put yourself in the shoes of others. And in a way you can break this down into two parts. The first part is called mentalization, and this comes down to the ability to put yourself in the mental shoes of others, so to understand the mental state of others. And the other aspect is empathy, which is to feel the emotional effect of other people. Now, on average, people with high agreeableness tend to have an increased awareness or sensitivity to this whole concept of theory of mind, but there is still some variance, and even people in the general public might be higher on mentalization versus empathy and vice versa. However, you can take a more interesting and extreme example to kind of signify what these are, and that is with mentalization, there is a group of people who are very good at this particular aspect but completely lack the other one, and that is psychopaths. Psychopaths find it relatively easy to put themselves in the mental state of others, and this is why they are very good at manipulating people, because they can understand what other people are experiencing and how they operate, but they don't necessarily feel the emotional effects of doing so, and therefore they feel very little remorse and they feel very little guilt from exploiting people, but they're able to manipulate people because of their high mentalization. Now, when it comes to the opposite situation, there's also a group of people who tend to experience the opposite effect, and that is they experience more of the empathy but less of the mentalization. These people are those with a high level of autism, and this is what makes it harder for them to socialize because they're less able to put themselves into the mental shoes of others, and therefore it's harder for them to resonate how other people act, what they think, and why they are the way they are. However, most autistic people are still receptive to emotional frequencies, and even though they might not necessarily intuitively understand why people are the way they are or why they do things the way they do, they can still pick up on the fact that something is wrong, someone is in distress, someone is sad, and so on. So I'm going to conclude with this. In order to flourish in any environment, you kind of need to balance the needs of yourself with the needs of others. And the point at which this is optimal is that of reciprocity. If you're able to reciprocate and give and take in a very even and balanced way, then you'll often make the most of your environment. And it's only with people who get this balance completely wrong, where they're either too selfish or not accommodating enough, where they have to pay some kind of internal or external price. And this could be the case in society as a whole, but even in your individual relationships. You need to get that balance where there is reciprocity, and in the case of a marriage, if you're able to give and take, and it's kind of an even split, then you won't have the resentment towards the other person for taking, and equally you won't be creating that feeling in the other person. Anyway, I hope you got something from this video. If you did, then I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe, but even feel free to leave a comment down below where you leave your thoughts, questions, or even let me know how you did in the Big 5 personality test, which I've also left in the description. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.